Hi everyone, and welcome back. We are joined today by Diego Sequera, an Venezuelan journalist, to discuss what is happening at the moment in Venezuela. So, thank you so much for coming on the program.
Thank you, Glenn. It's an honor to be here.
So, as we all know, Venezuela is the country with the most proven oil reserves in the world, which is good reason to be concerned when Washington begins to speak about democracy and human rights. And as we see at the moment, the United States, after having made some speeches about the concern about drugs and human rights in Venezuela, we now have warships steaming ahead toward the coast of Venezuela. So, again, for people outside of Latin America, how can we understand what is actually happening there now?
Well, the whole rationale to justify all this warship movements with Marines and so on, it's basically the U.S. now says that current President Nicolás Maduro is the head of a drug cartel called El Cartel de los Soles, the Suns cartel, in a way to associate it with the high-level military, with generals, basically. And the funny thing is, and they actually declared it a terrorist organization, I think it was 2 weeks ago. But the thing is that there's no actual documented record in the last decade or more of the existence of this said cartel. So actually, that's the rationale also based on doubling down the bounty against the president. Mind you that already in 2020, it was a 25,000 reward to lead to Nicolás Maduro. In this case, now it's 50 million, sorry. Way above, for example, the Mohammed al-Jolani, aka Ahmad al-Sharaa, the current president of Syria and member, of course, as you will also know, of Al-Qaeda. So, well, it's a high race, but there's a lot of things, a lot of mechanics going on behind it. And of course, the obvious one, as you already said so, Glenn, which is oil interest in Venezuela, also the longest shoreline in the whole Caribbean basin.
Well, I was curious what the amount of assets, military assets, the United States is pushing towards the region. What is realistic? Because again, a ground invasion seems ruled out. It wouldn't be sufficient. But would it be? Is this simply to put pressure, or are people in Venezuela concerned that it could also be a decapitation strike, as you suggested? The United States have actually put a bounty on the head of the president of Venezuela. And a lot of efforts have been done to delegitimize and criminalize, essentially treat the president as if he would be a wanted terrorist. So, but what could be the objective or purpose for this military buildup on the border of Venezuela?
Well, talking about these task force and fleets that are the warships that are approaching the Venezuelan shores or its whereabouts in the southern Caribbean, it's still not clear. It's not even clear for the White House, according to an Axios piece by Mark Caputo from like 2-3 days ago, which basically stated that not even in the highest level, they're not completely sure if it's what they stated says, which is like a counter-narcotics operation. But if it is a counter-narcotics operation, you don't need all this military amount, but at the same time, they also say it's regime change, but they don't explicitly say so. So formally, it's quite unclear what's going to actually happen. For us, especially the last week, it has been, of course, it seems for now more like a power projection and also testing the grounds and how the government and the society and even the region reacts to this kind of movements. It kind of seems that way, which I think it also has been enough to set a message. I mean, it's not as soft and easy a target as they might expect and know neither the Venezuelan society or the government entered into panic mode in any way or form. But nevertheless, of course, our president called for national mobilization, and there's a lot of military movement going on the borders, and also a lot of people enlisting in the national militia in order to defend the country. Also, well, national mobilization has like these two key components. One is the actual military one, and the other one is the symbolic psychological one. And I think that also amounts to a response, an indirect or a factual response to the U.S. Also, you have what people on the region, important players on the region, I might add, what are they saying? And I think about Gustavo Petro, the Colombian president right now, and Claudia Sheinbaum from Mexico. They've been quite categorically about opposing any kind of adventure, especially because there's no actual evidence. Even there's a piece by Pino Arlaki, I think it's his name, who was the former secretary of UNDOC, the UN agency specialized in drugs and crime, basically saying, it's an op-ed published by the Lante Diplomatico in Italy, by the way, Glenn. And he basically says it makes no actual sense. Venezuela has been one of the best and the most efficient countries fighting drug trade in the whole hemisphere. Just like Cuba, by the way, he also stated. So, and he also basically sums it up and says this is all about oil. If the US was actually concerned about drug trafficking, about narco structures, about criminal networks, he should perfectly see other places, just like, for example, Ecuador. Ecuador in the last couple of years has basically become like the hub for all these criminal structures in alliance, and this is based on evidence, with the current government of Daniel Noboa, who's, by the way, it's part of a legacy family from Ecuador that actually owned the banana business, but they also own the whole chain of production and supply of bananas into Europe and into North America. So if we see it from that point of view, it's quite flimsy. But here's a precedent also that you have to take into account, and you need to be reminded. Back in 2020, when the first bounty was issued against our president, there was a meeting that's it was written by Mark Esper's former Secretary of Defense on the first Trump administration, wrote about it in his memoirs. He basically talked about a meeting right after the failed coup attempt of Juan Guaido on April the 30th and May the 1st. And this was like a brainstorm of ideas. It was the Secretary of Defense, it was Mauricio Claver Carone, the special representative for Venezuela inside of the National Security Council. It was also Elliot Abrams, and it was also William Barr as the Attorney General back then. And during that discussion, Barr was the one that actually came forward and proposed, like, look, we cannot, basically, I'm paraphrasing here, but he says, like, we cannot, Juan Guaido didn't succeed, and there's no sense in representing this as a struggle for democracy. So we have all these issues with Nicolás Maduro, and we have all this corruption and whatnot, whatever accusations they got in, we should treat this as a criminal case, as a matter of security for the region, and a matter of security for the US in particular regarding regarding the drug trafficking and whatnot. Actually, there was a report written by Douglas Farah during those days from Ivy Consultants that actually coined the term joint Bolivarian criminal enterprise. And that kind of became, for a short while, like the stable word to refer to the Venezuelan government. Mind you that already back then and now, which is now it's even more ambiguous, they didn't recognize the Venezuelan government and our president as the legitimate rulers of Venezuela. And they clearly stated recently, Caroline Leavitt, I think it's her last name, the spokesperson for the White House, basically wasn't too clear about what's the purpose of the task force, but she didn't mince in mixing up the drug dealing thing with regime change, but without being too explicit regarding both. So that's basically that ambiguous area is where we are right now.
Yeah, the search for legitimacy to take actions, hostile action is it's always interesting because you looked at, Libya was the human rights, Iraq was the WMDs, Syria, of course, human rights issues, and of course the case they were making for chemical weapons. So no, it is interesting that military action against Venezuela would be then legitimized based on a criminal case that is arguing that the Venezuelan president is the head of a drug cartel. But another interesting comparison, though, is what the United States have done in other parts when they looking for regime change operation. That is, in Libya, they recognized an alternative government, simply, just choosing the representative of another country. We saw the same in Syria, recognizing the government, different governments, and this was also done, of course, in Venezuela. The United States said that Juan Guaido was the actual leader of Venezuela. It of course it doesn't it doesn't make much sense, but to a lesser extent, we also seen the same in Belarus, by the way. This is not an official recognition, but where they pretend as if they pretend as if there is an alternative leader for Belarus. So there it's Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. But it does beg the question, though, if the United States would seek to topple the government or put a lot of pressure, get someone on the inside of the military, any form of regime change operation, decapitation strike, usually they would want someone waiting in the rear, someone who can take over. I mean, that's kind of the purpose of a regime change war.
Yes.
Is Venezuela exposed to this at the moment? Are there any powerful forces which are looking to work with the Americans to replace Maduro in a regime change? Because places like Ukraine, they built up a clear, powerful opposition. But has this kind of work been done in Venezuela?
I think there are two things at play here. One, it has to do with even with Trump's own experience regarding Venezuela and how he was. This is on Bolton's memoir, by the way, how he felt duped by the Venezuelan opposition. Now I'm not sure now it was Bolton or Esper, maybe Esper, because it was a much more sober take of things, partial but sober nevertheless, and less egotistical. But basically, he felt duped by the Venezuelan opposition, especially because of what they fed their own officials in the State Department and National Security Council about how easy it was already to just topple the Venezuelan government, how weak it was, how was it in its last days, and it was just a matter of a swift push, and that was it. And of course, that didn't happen. We're talking about something that happened 6 years ago. So you have that. You have like Trump's skepticism about Venezuela, about not only Venezuelan players, but also the U.S. players regarding Venezuela. In this case, Rubio himself. I think that, and talking about Rubio before we get more into him, he already has someone who has been their asset for a long time, and I can say it's a direct Marco Rubio asset in this case, which is Maria Corina Machado. She is a very chameleonic character. She has declared herself now as liberal as Milei. She is pretty close to the Likud party in Israel. She's probably with the most antagonistic figures, ideologically speaking, throughout the world. And of course, and she has supported even the most draconian moves against our own migrants in the U.S. So there you got it. That would be your figurehead. The thing is that she wasn't able to run as a presidential candidate. So back in last year, they tried to run a proxy one, which is it also seemed more like elder abuse than a political power play. Which was Edmundo Gonzalez that basically lost the election. But of course, they had to make a contentious situation and try to make it the whole chapter about the tallies and the fraud and whatnot, and to try to keep on the delegitimization going on regarding the Venezuelan government, as it would be completely impossible for an electoral win by Nicolás Maduro, which he actually had. So they do have someone in the back burner, which is this lady, but at the same time, I don't know how much Trump trusts all the Venezuelan opposition at this point. Probably nothing. And so there's no actual overstated plan for or person for the day after. Not yet, at least, because they haven't even acknowledged the fact that this could be officially a regime change operation, a regime change pressure move, maybe. So that part is not clear. But you also, talking now back to Marco Rubio, that here's what you need to think about, I think, regarding the Venezuelan context. Trump plays a two-track game with Venezuela. At least that's what he has been doing ever since he started back in January. He has a special envoy in this case, which is Rick Grenell. And then he has the State Department ran by Rubio. Rubio, in this case, McNamara in Colombia, that's supposedly our ambassador in Colombia representing the U.S. interest in Venezuela. So these are the two basic channels that Venezuela has with the U.S. or the U.S. has with Venezuela. And they play different games. I mean, Rick Grenell has been able even to secure some deals, as in, for example, releasing some people that were in jail here that are U.S. citizens that are with a very dodgy resume, but nevertheless they wanted to be released, and they were, as a gist of goodwill, there was an exchange between these people, and also to releasing from the Sequera prison in El Salvador 252 Venezuelan citizens that were unlawfully held there. So, and this was Grenell bit. Also, the Chevron renewal of their own licenses recently here in Venezuela, their own licenses from the sanction program, was also Rick Grenell's work. But on the other hand, you have like the tougher stance of Rubio, but Rubio is not all alone by himself. He represents also several power structures, not only the obvious one, which is the Southern Florida power group, but also the Zionist interests. As you know, AIPAC posted about John Radcliffe and Marco Rubio being like their favorites and their helping hands inside the White House. So I think this is my gut feeling or my impression after all this and seeing what we've seen so far. I think Trump is actually, and you haven't listened directly to Trump say anything about this task force, about these warships in the Southern Caribbean. You haven't, but you have heard Rubio a lot. So I think it's also Trump allowing this Rubio track to see how far he has been able to go, and how far, and if he's going to succeed. If he sees chances of actual success, probably he's going to own the move and start to make it a Trump thing. But for the time being, that doesn't seem to be the case. Nevertheless, Marco Rubio is quite busy visiting the region and also creating some sort of coalition of the willing, by the way, which is basically now composed by Milei's Argentina, Paraguay, ever so willing to be, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, and I might be missing someone else, but basically that's the coalition of the willing that Marco Rubio is trying to set up in order to, well, we don't know what, but we have clear evidence of all these ships and submarines and 4,000 Marines, which is not a significant force, near our shores. So in a way, you can see, we can suppose they're creating the whole atmosphere, the whole climate, the same way that they've tried to do it also on the media. I mean, like I told you before we got into the recording, people from other places, well-informed people, actually asked me what's going on in Venezuela. Are you actually going to war right now? Is it martial law being declared? A lot of nonsense, which of course it explains what the mainstream media must be up to, and also the social media. And even I could even imagine friendly fire in this in Telegram channels and whatnot, like playing offside regarding what's going on here in Venezuela right now. So that's where we are. But also, if you go a bit further and check out some of the Austin enjoyers around that are actually following the naval moves, you have, for example, it's now in Panama, crossing the Panama Canal, but it's going to be close to our shores soon. It's the USS Lake Erie, who has like laser-guided precision missiles, among other things. But this destroyer, it's actually going to be out of commission for the next fiscal year. The fiscal year, it's until September, if I'm not mistaken. So what actually is going to happen with this ship? Also, based on the Austin enjoyers, you have also the Iwo Jima Task Force, which is composed by 3 warships that left Norfolk like 10 days ago. It was supposed to pick up the Marines at North Carolina and then move into to Venezuela, but it actually, a 12-hour itinerary, they made it in like 10 days. And then they went back to Norfolk because back at that moment, last week, there was a hurricane threat because of Hurricane Eddie. We're now in hurricane seasons in the Caribbean right now. So it's kind of weird if you see what actually they are doing. Same with the drills now in southern Puerto Rico. So it looks, if we take it as it is right now, it looks like a lot of grandstanding, a lot of psyop going on, and a lot of testing the region and and probably the psychology of the society and the government at this moment. But this is as of today, September the 1st. It's hard to predict.
Well, it's interesting what you said about Trump possibly taking a back seat and let Marco Rubio drive this thing. But it is the the power dynamic within the United States. It's worth looking for whether or not this is how the war is being sold to him, because it appeared to me that, for example, with the attack on Iran, that it had been oversold to Trump how easy it would be to have a regime change, that, you kill some of the political and military leadership, and then suddenly people will flood to the street for to get rid of the ever so hated regime, and they would, welcome their the aggressor as their savior. And of course, we see no such thing. And but again, this overselling how despised the government is, and the preparedness for people to rise up and topple it and embrace the U.S. invaders instead. It is important to get the war approved within the United States, though. But which is why it's often a good as a good thing to look for what's happening within the United States to see if any red flags are going up. Um, but I did want to ask, though, if the United States launches like a bloody nose attack, that is, strike a little bit at Venezuela, and essentially threatening, if you retaliate, then there will be much bigger punishment. The danger then is always one ends up like Middle Eastern countries, where they're just bombed every now and then. Do you think how would Venezuela react to such? Do they have the ability to strike back? And I heard discussions about drone programs or in Venezuela, but I'm not sure if they are exaggerated. Um, what are the capabilities, and how do you think Venezuela would use those capabilities if there would be like a limited bloody nose strike, or a different form of show of force, which is not a full invasion, but anything
Sure.
less of this?
Sure. Well, as you might expect, Venezuela's doctrine currently, the Bolivarian doctrine, basically, it's regarding superpower like the U.S. It would have taken an asymmetrical approach. And also, at the same time, Venezuela has significant air defenses. It's not as easy as other countries in the region. Actually, that was one of the reasons it stopped. Back in 2019, there was like this attempt to do some military pressure from Brazil and from Colombia back then, and the Brazilian military actually pushed back, not only because of the complications and the implications this might have, but also because of the air defenses, and also because another extra fact would be they would lose their strategic depth of their own military doctrine based on the Amazon. But they were deterred in that way, as in not being the best of ideas. Also, you don't have Colombia right now as a platform, at least you don't have the Colombian government as a platform as willful as it was back in 2019, 2020. That's why Marco Rubio is pushing so much Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago this time. And actually, that's where one of the main dangers rely, from my point of view. But you also have to take one more thing into account regarding the possible reactions of the United States. First, on pair with all this grandstanding of the last 2 weeks, there has been successive terrorist plots that have been foiled throughout a year. The Interior Minister talked about 20. I remember at least 10 that have been made public in press conference with a huge amount of connections, including in one of them a active SEAL, from Chicano extraction. And this was in September of last year, by the way. The most recent one was like 3 weeks ago, which involved, by the way, Albanese criminal structures hailing from Ecuador. It involved criminal networks in Venezuela, and also the extremist factions of the opposition. It included even to blow up with TNT a new square in a very bustling area of Caracas with 3 kilos of TNT. A square, by the way, which is a homage to the day of victory of the Soviet Union victory against the Nazis, which also has a flame, which has its own gas canister. So just imagine how what a terror attempt of this magnitude could have in a place like Venezuela. So I think that there's always been a piece missing here, which is actually the internal strife they've been looking for, and they know they can't do it now in a color-coded fashion. So this brings us to this other element. So in what way could Venezuela defend itself? It's hard for me to venture too much, too far, as in striking back, for example, precisely with drones or something else, one of these ships, or in the case of some disembarkment or something. The government has been quite clear that all the U.S. that are uninvitedly arriving to our shores would be quite easy to come in, but it won't be so easy to come out. That's basically one of the main statements you can hear from many political and military officials talking about this. So, but also at the same time, of course, they warn this could be a huge disaster. It will have global implications, and especially it has regional implications that are far to be calculated right now. So I'm not sure. I know it would be a mix of asymmetrical and maybe some proportionate response in a defensive way, but I don't know how far would that go. And I don't know also, but maybe which would be the economic energy impliance of this, because they probably are also planned here, and I'm just not able to, to give an informed opinion of this. But it would be a mix of these 3 things, if you ask me.
Well, you spoke before about other Latin American countries. So Argentina, for example, might be part of the coalition of the willing to go after Venezuela. While, of course, Venezuela always had a difficult relationship with Colombia, but now there's a very different government in place. So it doesn't appear that this will be the case now. But in terms of looking at the possible responses from the rest of the region, irrespective of their relationship with Venezuela, because Venezuela has some difficult relationship in the region, but wouldn't there be, irrespective of this, for countries like Brazil and others, wouldn't they be a bit cautious about an actual attack? I mean, the entire region has a very bad history of American imperialism, the regime change, invasions, or just general attacks. Surely no one would want to open this can of worms, because once one begins to invite it in, this kind of military adventurism, the region could be very quickly turned into another Middle East. So how much does this play into the calculation? Because even countries who do not care that much for Venezuela or the Maduro government would, nonetheless, it doesn't seem like a great idea to invite this into Latin America.
Yes, it's you probably are aware of this. I mean, but Latin American unity has been like a historical constant ever since its inception, ever since its independence started. Actually, the first forefathers of independence actually never thought about 23 different countries. They just thought about a whole region. So that's like one of the historical forces that have been also ingrained in Latin American history ever since. Of course, the opposite of this, it's the obvious, more Pan-Americanist Monroe Doctrine kind of approach. And currently, Latin America, I think it's in a very bad place regarding that specific item, because you have, yes, you have a core of radical sovereignist and independent nations such as Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, the troika of tyranny, as Bolton addressed it once back then. And then you also have Mexico, which is pretty close, and they also have their own foreign policy doctrine, the Estrada doctrine, which basically says we oppose any kind of foreign meddling in any of the sovereign countries of our hemisphere, and Mexico won't engage in any of these adventures. And yes, also Brazil has a very cautious stand regarding all of this. And maybe we don't have like the best relationships right now, but not the worst either. And they would be I haven't heard anything coming from Lula or from Itamaraty, the foreign ministry. But it must be at some point they should and they will say something. And I don't think it's going to be ambiguous about it. But that's the case of Brazil, of course, which of course you would see the same threat onto them. And same with Colombia right now. And you also have the fact that, for example, Colombia has 7 official U.S. military bases, 2 that are unofficials. Peru has several military and naval bases. So does Chile. So in a way, they're already there. They don't need to invade properly. And as like Chalmers Johnson used to say, in the previous imperialism the previous imperial unit was the colony regarding the European imperialism. But the case of the U.S., the imperial unit would be the military base. So they're already here. Also the Caribbean, we have Curacao, and I mean, less than 100 miles from our coast, which is a Dutch colony. So it's NATO terrain also, Article 5 terrain, if you ask me. And many of these ships are also stopping there, by the way. And then you have an even more dramatic thing. Think about Milei, for example. Think about Nayib Bukele. Think about this new kind of leadership that it's not pro-US. It's completely subservient. It's like almost like US employees in this case. And also Dina Boluarte in Peru. The next Bolivian president will be of the same kind. So, and Paraguay, of course, always has been this way. Being Paraguay also, by the way, a very powerful drug trading hub. But so I expect I'm not optimistic about the region in that sense. And I'm pretty sure that many countries, the ones I've mentioned, probably will justify it and will support it. Trinidad and Tobago's prime minister already said she would. She would allow Trinidad and Tobago to be a base against Venezuela. She already said it. We have Guyana also. We have this a lot of details, but we have the Essequibo contentious also with Guyana on our eastern border, which of course, if the short version is that's Venezuelan territory that has been claimed since the 19th century. It was taken from us by the Brits. It has been going through the UN under an agreement in 1971, the Geneva Agreement, which actually it was like It would always enforce goodwill approach between the parts. And since 2015, ExxonMobil and the successive Guyanese government have been exploring on the maritime borders that are disputed between Venezuela and Guyana ever since. So, and this is like the perfect, and Irfan Ali, the current Guyanese president, it's also very close to Marco Rubio and very close to all these types in Colombia and everything else. He's partnered with Ivan Duque from Colombia in many businesses. So these are, I mean, they're even beyond proxies. I mean, these are basically subservient employees from the United States. So this will undermine any unified response from the region. There's a Venezuela, I think the Honduras, which is currently the pro tempore president of the Community of Latin America and the Caribbean States, which is the other body, the original body that it's been created as a counterweight to the OAS, which Venezuela is not part of. It's calling for a meeting. So this will be also a good benchmark to measure how the region is actually responding to this. But sadly, I am not at this point, I hope I'm wrong, but I'm not optimistic about a unified response from the region.
Yeah, it gives reason for concern. Well, my
Yes.
last question is just about the wider context here of what Venezuela has been going through over the past few years in terms of the sanctions, because they've been quite destructive for not just the economy, but leading to a lot of deaths as well as people emigrating. Now, I think that's relevant because the U.S. Didn't wake up today and decide to send their warships to Venezuela.
Yes.
I was wondering if you can speak about this, the sanctions regimes which has been imposed on Venezuela and some of the consequences of this.
Mind you that the sanctions were the first executive order, what we call the Obama decree, was in the 9th of March of 2015. Almost the same time that things were heating up with Guyana, by the way. And also, it reminded me of something. There's this series, I forgot the name of the journalist, but it's from the Washington Post. It's called The Money Wars. It's a very interesting one, but I really recommend to read it. He actually states that Venezuela's economic contraction, it's compared to 4 1929 cracks of the Great Depression. So that gives you an outsider amount of how much it has impact on the Venezuelan economy, Venezuelan livelihood, Venezuelan political process, Venezuelan social fabric, all of them. And it's not only sanctions, because of course it started, as it always starts with any country that's being sanctioned, as you know, sanctioning some government officials based on human rights abuses or whatnot, and it gets deeper and deeper until they started, aiming to critical areas, just like the Trump executive, the Trump administration, the first Trump administration did in 2017. That was a moment that the 24th of August, and I think it was Executive Order 13808, which actually, it's the first time it focused on the oil industry as being subject of sanctions. Then they sanctioned gold. They even got to sanction a cryptocurrency that they were trying to create back then. And this is where the main tragedy sanction wars happened. I mean, these were the worst years. We had a 3,000% inflation at some point. We had an oil revenue that dropped to 99% during those years. We had to reinvent ourselves in many ways, and also the government. And this also drove the government to diversify its economy and to bounce back as it has ever since. But along with the sanctions, Glenn, there have also been a whole set of experiments, if you think about it. 10 years of this, and even 11 if we count it from 2014, because the first color-coded uprising against Nicolás Maduro in February 2014 was actually the raw material for the law that created the sanctions a year after. And after that, we had, for example, a legislative branch that went rogue, stimulated, of course, by foreign actors. We also had an executive branch that was parallel. They were trying to create all these parallel institutions to traumatically transfer the sovereignty of Venezuela to all these ad hoc structures. We also had a filibuster attempt, a mercenary Diesen attempt to kill our president back in 2020. I mean, we have these are all under the frame of the maximum pressure campaign back then. Then we had a more Democrat-style attempt last year that actually relied on NGOs and proxies in order to deny the electoral results. And now we're back to this. So it's not only sanctions, I mean, which it has, yeah, according to a report by Mark Weisbrot and Jeffrey Sachs, they talked about 40,000 people dead because they have, and we're talking about this in the report is from 2019, especially on curable diseases, on organ transplants and whatnot that couldn't be solved before. Before this, Venezuela had the highest salary of the whole hemisphere. We were the most prosperous country, and suddenly we went from 100% to zero. And then of course, it was also based on our own weaknesses, our own contradictions, our own secular shortcomings. They also exploited all of them in order to bring collapse. And regardless of how close we've been there, it hasn't happened. They haven't succeeded. And I don't think they will succeed now either, regarding the amount of harm they are actually willing to ensue against us. We'll see. I mean, like I said, Trump is also making a calculation here that is a very domestic one. I'm thinking of a comment you make, a remark you made before. Rubio represents also Florida. Florida, it's basically the model of the government management, not only because of the Southern crazies in the Congress, like they call them. I mean, we're talking about Carlos Jimenez, Maria Elvira Salazar, Mario Diaz-Balart, but also Susie Wiles, who comes from Florida, and also Mike Waltz, that comes from Florida. And Florida actually, it's like a turbo capitalist model of management. It's like a fire estate. I mean, finance, insurance, and real estate, and also has like the worst labor laws in the whole country right now. So it's further means a lot of things to the Trump administration, and also means a lot of things in Congress, and it also means a lot of things electorally. And mind you, we have midterm elections next year. So I think all this amounts to those variables we got here. And also, I mean, I can name so many factors that are all related and how they've been weaponized or deformed based on sanctions and based on the economic distortions that comes after that. And also to accuse of corruption a country that is looking ways to not be drowned or choked or blockaded in order to keep on living and in order to keep a decent amount of normalcy and sovereignty and independence as well. So the other thing to close this is that given that this is not more a Wilsonian approach to policymaking, this is a Rooseveltian approach. Kind of like, I think it was Kissinger at diplomacy, he called it the hinge between these two kind of power projections, the Roosevelt kind and the Wilsonian kind. You know, the Wilsonian would be like spreading democracy and liberty, that's US responsibility, but Roosevelt is basically focused on our interest in the way to safeguard, and regardless of any kind of means, even under the Monroe Doctrine, even under the Roosevelt Corollary, that basically says we're not going to do any aggression in the region, but if any government, I'm paraphrasing here, any government is unable to solve their own problems, we might have to jump into solving ourselves, basically. You know, that's part of the rationale of the Roosevelt Corollary here. So we're kind of back in that point, and in a very messed up way, because you have like this basic expeditionary rationale with sanctions and all the humanitarian and all the narrative approach we got. So it's still an open question, at least for now, September the 1st, while we're recording this. My take is nothing's going to happen this week. It's just going to mount depression in the narrative, but maybe not on a kinetic way. But let's see.
There's something grotesque about this, though, in terms of
Absolutely.
the economic hitman to destabilize the country, and then once you see the disaster unfolding, attribute this solely to the mismanagement of the country by the political leadership, and then using this as a reason for regime change. It's a bit like fomenting in the Middle East when they foment armed rivalry between different groups, and then call for the humanitarian interventionism once
Exactly.
the crocodile tears comes. But well, before we go, I wanted to ask you where can people find you, though, to follow your work, because you're quite a prolific journalist as well. You produce a lot of work. So where can people go?
First of all, the first stop is misionverdad.com. Most of our work, it's in Spanish. You can AI translate it, or the OrinocoTribune.com also translate many of our pieces. And personally, I'm also collaborating with many outlets. It depends on the moment. It depends on the opportunity. Be it Press TV, sometimes the Grayson, and sometimes other outlets. It depends on the moment. So, but if the central place would be Misión Verdad, which means truth mission in English. It's a word game, a very Chavista word game regarding the Chavista context. But that would be the main place to go, not only of my work, but also the work of the team, which is far more industrious than mine, and they're always at it all the time. So that would be the place to go. We have been pretty shadow banned on X, so we don't use it that much for these days. We have a very prolific Telegram channel, which I invite everyone to follow it. Thank you so much for this.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time, and yeah, it's of course great to see you again.
Yes, happy to see you again, Glenn. Anytime.